impetus for this is that we can't really understand religion without having some idea of what reality means to each of us, and it may mean something different to each of us. Each one of us will lead from the experience gained spending a career studying what we will be discussing. It's a very impressive and engaged group. So while each session will be able to stand on its own, the best experience will come from integrating the myriad perspectives that will emerge from the ensemble of presenters and all of the participants who will participate. It's not a course, and so there's no attendance, and if you feel like coming to 2 out of 7, that's exactly what you should do. If you feel like coming to 1 out of 7. In other words, session number 4 does not require that you have attended sessions 1 to 3. And I think that's an important point. So, what's it going to be? And the first slide, what else? Okay, so here is the schedule. January 8th, most of you are aware is tonight. Animals I have known and their realities. This will be my section, this first one. And you'll get the idea as we go on that reality is almost impossible, the concept to get your head around. And so we have a number of different people. So I'm going to talk from the perspective of a biologist and the idea that we are a single species who, as we do so many other things, think that reality is what humans perceive. But maybe that's not all of reality, and so I'm going to talk about reality from the basis of other animals. Raleigh is going to talk about, as a theologian, going to talk about religion and reality, what insights religion can provide, and the religious perspective. Somehow the slide isn't right, Rudolph.
It is overlaid by the...
Okay, so February 12th, Get Real, and this will be given by, oh wait 1 second, by Lou Stern, and Lou is a psychologist, and so he'll be talking about reality in terms of social interactions. On February 26th, we have Sangaku Dan Jocelyn. Dan is a Buddhist priest, and he'll be talking about reality from the perspective of Buddhism. And these are really very different perspectives. So from the perspective of Buddhism, the concept of reality is almost a group consensus. And not that there is something there like that camera, but rather that we all agree that there's something there that is that camera. That's very different. March 12th, that will be Rudolf Oldenburg, how we know about the world around us. Rudolf is a physicist and a microscopist, and he deals all the time with what am I looking at through these oculars, if you're still using oculars, and how does that relate to what really is there underneath?
First steps of perception, and then the rest is done by the brain.
How we measure things, that's John Jackson, who's sitting in the back. In John's career, when I asked him what he did years ago, he said, I measure things. So you would expect that somebody who measures things has a real grip on reality. But he's going to point out that maybe it's not as clear-cut as it seems. April 9th is our Sense of Self Too Narrow. This will be by Jessica Mark Welsh and Betsy Wilder, and Betsy is sitting here. And they're going to talk about our microbiome and the fact that we don't exist as we are looking at each other, but rather we've made up of a community of organisms and microorganisms. And I think you're going to point out that the bulk of our DNA is actually not human. Is that correct? So that's kind of an interesting take on reality. And then finally, we'll end up with it's kind of a summary of what we've heard. And again, it's really important for us, I think for all of us, that it be a group exercise. And that last component, really, hopefully everybody will contribute to. So I was turned on to the topic when I read a book, and the book's name was An Immense World. And the author of that was Ed Young. And what that book does is talk about sensory systems in an endless number of organisms. I mean, the amount of research he must have done is mind-boggling. He's a very well-known author. I think he was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. And it's impossible to read that book. He actually never talks about reality, but it was impossible for me to read that book and not realize that an insect's concept of the world around them, reality, is utterly different than ours, and it's primarily because their sensory systems are so different. I mean, what do we know of the world around us other than what comes in through our various sensory organs? And if those are different, your perception of reality is different. So I was right in the midst of trying to make sense of that when Rudolph said to me, hey, you want to see this incredibly cool YouTube TED Talk? So anything Rudolph says, I think is probably good. And so we sat together and watched this TED Talk. I don't remember who the speaker.
Donald Hoffman,
Donald Hoffman,
neurologist and psychologist.
So the bottom line to it was that, correct me if I'm wrong, my take from it was that what we see is absolutely not necessarily what we're looking at. And rather what it is what our brain does with whatever input is coming in, sensory input. But they're different. But of course we can never know they're different. And he goes through a series of kind of physics observations to get us to that point, but that's something that Rudolph will talk about, not me.
I was angry at the end.
You were angry.
At the end of this talk, because I think in the end it's not helpful to think that what we experience here is not what it is. It's like icons on the desktop here. The actual file that this icon represents, if you have a file icon on the desktop, the actual file is somewhere in here in the memory, and it's ones and zeros and so on. The icon is not your file. And he says, what we see are icons as the desktop. The actual reality behind it is something that can be totally different. And I didn't like it. I don't.
Yeah, I was going to say what you're seeing is only the tip of the iceberg of rage. Rudolph actually feels that this concepts that this guy Hoffman is putting forward, and it's going to be really entertaining to listen to him. The way I put it is, what you see is essentially a symbol of reality, rather than an accurate mirroring of reality. But Rudolph will do a much better job. My pervasive theme today is to point out that the lifestyle of an animal results from their particular array of sensory equipment. And their sensory equipment has evolved to facilitate their lifestyle. And so there's this constant interactive dance. That what does evolution do? What do? We always try and infiltrate a niche where the competition is least. So the more specialized an organism is in terms of being able to live in that environment, and the more specialized its equipment is for that environment compared to another animal, allows it to exploit that environmental niche. And by environmental niche, at the extreme, for example, hot springs underneath the ocean. Well, there's very few organisms that can live in those hot springs. So if you have evolved the equipment to live there, you got it made. If you have to like living in a hot spring. But it's a dance, and the dance is that as those organisms live there, they become ever more adapted to that environment, because that's where they are, and every evolutionary change that makes them more amenable to that environment gives them that much more advantage. And so what you end up is with creatures who have radically different sensory equipment, each of them adapted to the environment that they are occupying. And what does that mean in the end? Their reality is that particular environment. So were a bacteria in a hot, I think it's called a hot spring, were they thinking bacteria, they would think this is what life is all about. Life is a hot spring. They wouldn't know that there's anything that's not underwater, that's not all of that. And it's a lot like, many of you probably know Plato's analogy to the cave. And these people in the cave see only images on a wall. And to them, those images is what the outside world is. But it's not the outside world, it's images on the wall of the cave. But there's no way that they would know that, because all they see is those images. And I'm going to make the case that for animals and for reality, your sensory equipment is everything. So I love the title. I love the title, The Nature of Reality, because it begs the question of whether there's an absolute reality. So a lot of people and I think this comes, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, this actually to some degree defines our political parties. How comfortable you are with uncertainty determines what kind of government you'd like to have to some degree. If there is no objective reality, and reality is a relative phenomenon, in the case of organisms, depending on your sensory apparatus, some people are extraordinarily uncomfortable with that concept. They want an objective reality, and that happens in religion too. Some religions are far more dogmatic and basically state this is the way it is. Some religions, and I would venture that you is one of those, is much more open to the idea that there's many, many different realities, many different interpretations of reality. So, if reality is not a rigid, absolute concept, to each of the creatures on Earth march to the drum of a different reality. And that's what we're talking about. In the TED Talk that Rudolph and I watched together, the concept of reality was distilled down to a series of mathematical equations. I thought they were quite difficult to follow, and they had to do with evolution, consciousness, how much of what we think reflects a concrete and independently verifiable entity, independent of what our brain does to make sense of the flood of sensory input. So I know I keep hammering this point over and over again, but I'm doing it because it's really the essence of what we're going to be talking about. Is reality an objective thing, or is it just this kind of squishy thing that is different depending on who you are? So what do I have to tell you? First of all, I started out as an ethologist. Ethology is the study of animal behavior. And I became intrigued with the concept of Umwelt.
Of what?
Umwelt, U-M-W-E-L-T. And the concept of Umwelt is the concept or the idea of what is the world like for any given animal. So in studying animal behavior, we're basically asking, what is the world like to a fly? Or what is the world like to a dog? Or what is the world like to a human? And it's really important to understand their behavior to understand what it is that they perceive in the world, their own glimpse. So our worlds are formed from the perceptions that we let in through our sensory systems, and different sensory systems lead to different perceptions. And I hope you'll forgive some repetitions, but sometimes repetition isn't so bad. But first of all, the commonality. When we talk about sensory organs, all sensory organs in the animal kingdom are designed to detect energy. So the unifying force, if you want to call it a unifying force, in terms of our perception of reality, is based upon energy. So we have things like photons, which have energy, vibrations through the ground, air pressure changes, thermal energy, that's movement of molecules as a function of temperature. All of those things are energy driven. All of those things, plus many more, of the same type, are the things that inform us of what's happening outside of ourselves. Okay, so you're hearing what I'm saying right now because of air vibrations that I'm generating with my voice that impinge upon your eardrum, that then goes through these little tiny bones to get to your inner ear, and they then activate hairs in your cochlea, and those hairs are connected to your auditory cortex. Through that entire chain of events, you make some sense of my voice, those vibrations that I'm generating. All right, as a biologist, I'm going to talk about reality from a biologist's standpoint. First of all, it's really important to understand some concepts of evolution. One of the things that's really important is that biologists talk about evolution as a conservative process. And what do we mean by conservative? Conservative means that you don't reinvent the wheel. So when evolution has come up with something that works, for example, apparatus to detect air movements and read them out as sound, well, that happens over and over again. It's used over and over again. The actual apparatus might be different, but the concept is the same. Detection of air movement as sound. So that's an important concept. At the most elemental level, all animals share the concept of an energy sensing strategy to discern their reality. I'm ignoring so many things, but others will pick it up. For example, we have signals generated internally that don't require those sensory organs, but let's ignore those because that's not what I'm talking about. But they will be covered. Each organism has evolved its own special transduction apparatus that allows it to exploit a unique set of environmental conditions. For example, in the deep sea, or deep within an underwater cave, there's very little light and there's no color. So what has happened? The organisms that exploit that environment have lost eyes. So they don't have eyes anymore. So their perception of reality doesn't include light, doesn't include vision. Again, it's like those animals living in the vents who think that's what the world is like. Well, to these crustaceans, there's crayfish who do it, there's fish who do it. That's their reality. The other biological correlate, the reason this happens, is that evolution is designed to not waste energy of any kind. Creating an organ and running it takes a lot of energy. So we get rid of whatever isn't useful and get rid of the need for that particular energy to run it. So their reality is formed from many sensory inputs, but vision isn't one of them. To live in a low light environment, the opposite can also happen, and there's a number of creatures who have developed a super sensitivity to light. And in those environments, those creatures can still see when to us it's pitch black. So it can work either way. In addition, there's animals like hawks who have developed super sharp vision, so that a hawk, as many of you probably know, can see a mouse moving in a field from way high. There's a cost. They cannot see close-up things very well. But, as I said out at the beginning, they are maximizing their ability to operate this niche. That niche is 400 feet in the air and needing to find things, like it's a small animal. A pit viper snake can sense the heat from a mouse held at arm's length. So if the snake were here, the mouse was there, they're not looking at the mouse. They don't need to see the mouse. They can sense the heat from the mouse. We can't. We don't occupy the same niche. So, after this, our sensory apparatus detects the energy that I'm talking about. We talked about all kinds of things, temperature, light. After that, there's a lot that happens. And the critical thing is, the bigger the brain, the more that can happen. So what do I mean by more happening? I made it a point not to put up slides of things, so that, because I didn't want it to seem like a comparative physiology course. But the flip side, of course, is I have to use words, but I'm going to do that. So that, for example, let's take, we could take either vision or hearing, we could take any number of things. Let's take hearing. Here's the sound coming in, it's vibrating my eardrum, it's hitting those three bones, it's heading towards the cochlea, activating those hairs in the cochlea, and those hairs are arranged in a snail-like spiral. And the frequency is dependent on where in that spiral those sensory hairs lie. So you take the output from that cochlea, and those neurons farther upstream, more central to the periphery, farther upstream, can detect this came from the apex of this snail cochlea, this came from the outer band of that snail cochlea, and I'm going to translate that into what this sound actually means, and you'll either hear a flute or a tuba, based on which cochlear hairs are putting out the output. But that's higher order processing. Okay, it has nothing to do with the nature of the envision, the nature of the photon. A photon is a photon. There's not a green photon and a blue photon. What there is are receptors in your eye, in your retina, cones and rods, and the cones in particular are color-coded. So what happens is the photon hits a particular cone, and that travels up to higher brain centers, which can then interpret that as green or red or whatever. Trust me, what I'm saying will make sense in a little bit, even if it doesn't right now. I'm then going to make an analogy to music. And that analogy is, when this first input comes in, and out here, it starts to vibrate, and the eardrum, that's like hearing one instrument, which is useful. I mean, it's nice to hear an instrument, but it doesn't integrate inputs. It doesn't integrate a sound that's in the low register and a sound that's in the high register. That can only happen in parts of the brain that integrate inputs. So it has input from cochlear hairs in the low range and in the high range, and it puts them together, and suddenly you're not hearing an instrument, you're hearing a whole section of the orchestra. Okay, and then what happens is those auditory inputs that come into the auditory cortex are mixed with, in this case, visual inputs, which allow you to say, okay, it's that part of the orchestra that's playing right now, or it's that part, and that sound is associated with that, and we're going to integrate those two sounds, and suddenly you hear the orchestral mix of everything. Raise your hand if you understand what I'm saying. No, raise your hand if you don't. Because I can go back, and sometimes it's hard for me to understand, is everybody on board with what I'm saying? Okay. So it's the complicated blending of inputs from multiple modalities that shapes our reality. If at this moment it's the orchestra that we're making sense of, our reality is that orchestra playing, that can only happen by integrating all kinds of inputs. The kinds of integration that I'm talking about, the more neurons you have in your brain, the greater the degree of integration that's possible for you. So if you can imagine an organism, take the simplest organism, take a paramecium. You would think that a paramecium has no idea of what's going on outside its body. Now, I'm not claiming it has consciousness and is thinking that this is great music. But what it does have is if a paramecium is swimming along and hits the wall of the container that it's in, what does it do? It reverses the direction of its cilia, and its cilia is what's driving it. It reverses the direction of those and backs away from the wall. It has to have some concept of reality. The reality in this case is I'm hitting a wall. And I can't keep going in that direction, or it's not going to end well. So I'm going to back away from that wall. So how does it know that that's happening? Same transduction of energy that happens when you listen to the orchestra. What happens is it hits that wall, the membrane on the outside of that paramecium gets distorted, right? As you would expect, membranes are not this is not generating a huge amount of power as it slams into the wall. On the other hand, it doesn't need a lot of power. Bottom line is that membrane deforms, and as that membrane deforms, there are protein channels in that membrane, in this case calcium channels. They open up, calcium rushes into the paramecium and activates or reverses the direction of that cilia. Extraordinarily simple sounding event, and a minuscule part of your perceiving the orchestra. But conservation of process, in this case conservation of transducing energy into action. We know lots about the first stage. We know lots about photons hitting the retina. We know lots about sound hitting the eardrum. We know far, far less about the integration of all of these things. And what we really don't know, and what you'd really like to know in terms of reality, is what does it feel like? What is our perception of what's going on, which requires the integration of all these very, very many inputs? And what is the weighting of the hearing part? What's the weighting of the vision part? All of this is really hard. It's not that hard to measure electrical activity in the optic nerve. That's just a bunch of action potentials. But that's only the start of perception of what's going on. It's the very start of perception. It's really important. And probably it's something that Rudolph is going to talk about. But it's not our inner world. And our perception of reality is really a description of what's going on in the inner world. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to animals, which is really what I want to talk about. But I also want to say one other thing, both to the Zoom office people and also to the people here. Please keep in mind the questions that arise, and we'll do them at the end. What I would like to set up is have us be a bunch of adolescents. asking the kinds of questions that we asked as adolescents until we got busy with life, and we didn't ask those questions anymore. They're the questions of what is this all about? They're the questions. I was obsessed when I was a teenager with the question of what if we were all a figment of some larger intelligent beings thinking. I found that terrifying. I found it absolutely terrifying. In order to go on with life, I stopped thinking about it. What I'm inviting is, here we can think at that level a little bit. Let's see where it takes us. Okay, so let's start simple. Let's start with a scallop. And what I'm going to talk to you about is how science works to try and understand what these animals are living. You all know scallops, right? Anybody who's been to the beach knows what a scallop is. What I'm going to do is talk about the scallop, and then I'm going to talk about the pill bug. And what I'm going to do is try and create what their life is like. Now, there's all kinds of problems with that. They likely don't have cognition in the way we know it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have awareness. We don't know the answer to those questions. Those questions are beyond the kinds of things we can answer right now with science. We can't put ourselves into the brain, primitive as it is, of a pill bug. But they do have a brain. I mean, they make decisions. The kinds of decisions they make, some of them sound simple, but maybe not so much when you think about it. So, well, I haven't shown you the pill bug yet, but you can talk to me about turn alternation when you've seen that one. So why don't we do the first slide. That slide. Okay, so you all know what we're looking at here, right? Does anybody not know?
Maybe look.
Wait, you were premature.
Okay, sorry.
Make believe you never saw that. Now you're looking at the scallop. You're not looking at an animal, you're looking at the shell from the animal. Now let's go to the next slide. And what are you looking at now?
Dinner.
Yes, you're looking at dinner, a scallop dinner. And what is that dinner? What is that? Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is a clam. This is scallop, a living scallop. This is what none of you ever look at in all likelihood. This is what you eat. That's the adductor muscle, which is a major muscle in the scallop. It's what closes the shell, and it can close it very tightly. And it's very good. When it's sauteed, it's particularly good. But what you're not seeing when you're eating that muscle is all this other stuff. And so what you can see is two things in this picture. I don't know how many of you realize that scallops have eyes, but they do. They have up to 200 eyes around the rim. They're blue. They have blue eyes. Some people think they're blue because it protects from ultraviolet light. Some people don't. The one thing that everybody agrees on is that this would be an optician's dream. If this guy waddled into your office, you would need 200 glasses. These are another structure. What those are smellers. So that's like the scallop's nose. So right near each other you have vision and you have smell in the scallop. So let's go on to the next slide. Yes, this is another view of that same one, and I focused on it because you can see the eyes. How many of you knew that scallops had eyes? Oh my God, so what am I talking about? You already know, but a lot of people didn't know. So how did these eyes work? You would not think that a scallop, or at least I wouldn't have thought, that a scallop's eyes would work the same way as ours do. They don't exactly, but they do, again, because of conservation in some ways. So that what happens in your own eye when light hits it is there are molecules called opsins and chromatophores. It doesn't matter to understand that. What it means is that the light comes in, activates the opsin, which then causes a conformational change in the chromatophore, which then activates a nerve in the optic nerve and sends a signal up to the brain. Exactly that happens in the scallop eye. Exactly the same thing. There's no way to differentiate the two at that level. Each of these eyes is highly structured. Each one of those eyes has a pupil. As the light changes, the pupil gets bigger or smaller, just like ours do. This is a scallop with 200 of these eyes. I don't know about you, I'm blown away by it, actually. Especially when you look at the previous slide with the pan full of scallop mussels. You may never want to eat a scallop again once you realize what's going on here. Okay, so they all have a structure, they all have a pupil. As the light changes, each pupil changes in concert with each other. So you have 200 pupils getting bigger and smaller, totally in concert with each other. We focus light by making the pupil bigger and smaller, so do they. But there's a major difference there, and that's at the level I was saying that the individual apparatus is different, even though the principle is the same. So how do we change light? We make our irises contract or expand, and that makes the pupil get bigger or smaller. They don't do it that way. They have this incredible system of guanine crystals at the far end from where the light comes in their eye. Those guanine crystals are reflective. So what they've formed is a curved mirror, just like a telescope is. The light comes into their eye, each of their 200 eyes, bounces off that mirror, and then bounces back. I mentioned that they're guanine. Does guanine ring a bell for anybody? It's one of the base pairs in DNA. So isn't that odd that the base pair in DNA forms the mirror in the scallop eye? Pretty weird. So anyway, it bounces back. And just like in our eye, the light then finally hits the retina, which transduces the signal that then goes to the higher brain. Well, in these guys, they have two retinas. They have one retina which specializes in small things, and another retina which specializes in large things. So they basically have two retinas, one specialized for distance vision, and one specialized for close vision. So any of you who have had cataract surgery, you had to make a decision for your lens. Do you want to see far, or do you want to see near? The scallop has solved that problem. It has two different retinas, and it sees both of them simultaneously. Now the question that's kind of unanswerable to us right now, why? Why does the scallop have all these eyes? Why does it have this exquisite architecture of each of the eyes? What's that all about? We just, in the end, have no idea in the world what it's all about. Why this would happen. It's a mystery. Why so many eyes? It doesn't have enough neurons to integrate everything. Remember we said in our own visual system, we have higher brain centers that take inputs from all the different receptors and create an image. We basically see vision. Our vision is like a film. You know, it flows. You don't see little breaks in well, we only have two eyes, but you don't see breaks in what the two are doing because the input gets integrated. They can't possibly, I mean, with all due respect to the scallop, they can't possibly integrate the input from 200 eyes. But we have no idea why they exist. We have no idea why they have such fine structure. So when I said that I'm going to tell you stuff, I'm going to tell you stuff that we can't make sense of. That's one of those. So let me now tell you something more. This is going to blow your mind, so sit back. There was a professor, his name was Spicer, S-P-E-I-S-E-R, and he was very interested in what was going on with the scallop and the scallop fishing. And what he created was a little tiny chair that he tied the scallop onto, and he moved that little tiny chair so that there was a screen in front of it. So here's your scallop, I'll play the scallop, sitting in the chair, watching this screen in front of me, and on that screen, he made particles float by. And he changed the size of the particles, and he changed the speed of the particles. And what he noticed was that every once in a while, the scallop would open its shell as though it were ready to eat. But it didn't eat. It didn't move in the way that was compatible with eating. So what's going on? So I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you what he thought and what is now thought is going on. Remember I told you there were all those eyes, and then there was these little structures that smelled. So the idea, in the end, was that the eyes are like a guard system. It's like the camera in a security system. And what it does is let you know that something's going on. When that is signaled, then these smellers come and do a high-resolution test of what it is. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. but that's the current thinking. And how is that analogous to us? It's analogous to our tactile sense. So you have tactile receptors all over your body, all over your skin. But they do a very poor job of localizing what's going on. So what happens? If something pokes you, then you look. So you have a two-order system. One is a generalized sensor, that's these tactile receptors all over the place, and then a high-resolution sensor, which is your eyes. And the idea is that in this scallop, there's a constant scanning through the eyes and higher resolution sense through the smell. And then what happens? Have any of you ever seen a scallop escape? I actually hadn't seen it until I used to set up a tank, a saltwater tank for my grandkids when they were going to Children's School of Science. And we would go and collect things and put them in. And one of the things we collected was a scallop. And I had never seen this. All of a sudden, this thing zoomed across the tank, doing its shells like that. So how does it know to do that? Well, it knows it through its alarm system, initially through the eyes, and secondarily through the smellers. And that triggers this response. It's not so simple what we're talking about. It may sound simple, but to me it's not. They make decisions. They decide, am I going to escape or not going to escape? Am I going to hunker down or am I going to get out of here? They can also, with their smellers, tell if a starfish is around. The starfish is their predator. So if a starfish is what they smell, there's no two ways about it. They're out of there. And so that triggers that response. Let's go on to the next slide. Now I want to tell you about another animal that I happen to love. Some of you know this animal because they get into your basement, and some people view them as pests. But those are people who don't know them well. They're not pests. They're very interesting visitors. This is a pillbug. It's part of a class of animal called the isopods.
You spell that, Phil?
Pill, P-I-L-L, B-U-G.
Pillbug. I didn't get what you were saying until just now. I have no idea what you were saying about the next animal after the scout. It sounded
Pillbug.
like pillbugs.
Pillbug. Some people call them roly-polies.
Do they die and curl up in your basement?
Yes, that's what they do.
Oh, they're nice, yeah.
That's their modus operandi, right? Wait, we're not ready for the next one, though. So this is a pillow. It's called an isopod because pod is the word for feet. Iso is all the same. And its feet, its legs are all the same. So it's an isopod. This particular isopod is a pill bug. And its name, Latin name, is Armadillidium. And why is that? It looks like a little armadillo, doesn't it? And it's Armadillidium vulgare. Vulgare simply means common. So it's Armadillidium vulgare. And it is the most successful terrestrial crustacean. Most crustaceans live underwater. This one you've seen. But what does it mean that it's a terrestrial crustacean? It's living in a constantly hostile environment. It's almost like us living underwater because it's used to living underwater. It basically has gills. It has all kinds of things that allow it to live underwater. But this guy is saying, here's a niche that I want to occupy. None of the other crustaceans can follow me here because they don't have the equipment. And so what are the things that it has done? What is its reality in terms of what it has to do? So let's go to now we can go to the next slide. This is what some of you may have seen when you dig up this creature in the garden. It curls, it's called convolvation, but it's really just curling into a ball. And why would it do that? Number one, obviously it's protected because it has all this armor. But probably more importantly, the parts that water can evaporate from on what's called the ventral surface, the belly surface, aren't exposed anymore, so that moisture can't escape. The primary thing in this animal's life is moisture. It's in a hostile environment. If it loses moisture, it dies. Those are the curled up animals you see. They're not dead because they have no food. They're dead because they have no water. So this is one behavior that I found extraordinarily fascinating, and in fact, when I first went to graduate school, I saw this and I recorded from the nervous system to try and figure out, number one, how it knows to curl up, and number two, how does it curl up? Because it's neuromuscular system-like. But we're not going to talk about that. The next one. Okay, this is its reality. Every crustacean molts, right? It sheds its exoskeleton so that it can grow one size larger. During that period of molting, they are never more vulnerable than at that moment. First of all, they can't move because they move by having their muscles act against the exoskeleton, the shell. And if their shell is soft, there's not much they can do. So crayfish, for example, make it a real priority to hide. So that's why if you're going to keep crayfish, you need to have pots or something that they can hide under. These guys have come up with the most amazing mechanism. This is their reality. Their reality is that they're able to molt in two halves. No other creature is known to do that. So what happens when this half is molting, and that's why it's light colored here, it's shedding that skin, or that shell. But this one isn't. It can drag the rear end along as it finds someplace to hide. Then, after this one has molted and hardened, it's the front end's turn. And it does the same thing, and then the back end can drag the front end along. So it's an amazing phenomenon, but it's also amazing because molting opens it up to losing moisture. It loses that kind of waxy shield. So here, at any given moment during the molt, only half of it is doing that. And so I don't know what that does to your sense of reality, but it's a kind of schizophrenia. And then the question is, because I talked about this, what is the apparatus that it has to allow it to occupy this area? Number one, you saw these behavioral mechanisms. The antennae are loaded with humidity receptors. It's a sense that we don't really have. I mean, you know, you have it to a degree, hey, it's humid out. It's because you're sweating more. So these are much more specialized. To this animal, that thing is incredibly important, knowing the humidity. And so there's these receptors. All over its body, you can show the next slide. Yes. This is an ancient photograph that I took, and I took it over 50 years ago. And I took it on a lark. And the lark was, at the back of the animal, there's all these little pits. And I just had this curiosity, what are these pits? And I had a friend who was just beginning to do what was called scanning electron microscopy. And what that did was give you an electron micrograph, a picture from an electron microscope, of the surface. Typically, when you did electron microscopy, you had to section the animal and look at those sections, but here it's not what you do. So the question was, what are these things? And as we blew them up, it became clear that there were these little tongues sticking out of each one of these holes. And here's a bigger picture of one of those things sticking out from a hole. These are little tracheas, essentially, and the animal breathes through them. But just as it can take in oxygen through them, it can lose water through them. And so my idea, I never tested because I moved on to other things, is that this is a mechanism that allows them to close these, what are called spiracles, lose less water, and regulate them. You know, maybe open them sometimes when it needed to lose water. So there's an unanswered question in biology, and any of you are free to follow that up if you'd like. I would love to know the answer. Next slide. Oh, wait, I think I was going to say more about that. Give me just a second. My computer went to sleep.
Steve, just so you know, it's 8:03.
I'm going to stop very soon. Well, I may stop right now because it's not allowing me to. Good. So they sense things through their antennae, through their spiracles, which is what I just showed you. They also have little hairs called setae all over their body, loaded with humidity receptors. They have the biphasic molting, they have the curling, lots of specializations, lots of things that create a world for them that's different, utterly different than the world that we occupy. I don't want to get into the role of cognition in sense of reality, because I don't have any answers. But enough to say that they have, I don't know how to put it. I mean, they know, for example, that they have to hide before they molt, even by halves. They know they have to hide in a place that's moist. And in fact, it's very interesting. What happened is there would be huge conglomerations of isopods under a log, for example. And it used to be thought that they liked to be together, that they had what's called a thigmotropic response. But it turned out that's not the case at all. It's simply statistics. And if there's just one good place around and they're all moving independently of each other, they're all going to stop there. I guess it's like a good restaurant or something like that. A lot of people there at once. Okay, so I'm just about done. I just want to give you an idea of other things that create a lifestyle for an animal and a reality for an animal. So that moles, for example, live in a world without light, just like those deep sea animals. Snakes have thermosenses. So when they look around the world, what they see is temperature gradients, something we don't see. Ultraviolet light, you're all aware that some insects can see ultraviolet light that we can't. They see a different world. Creatures like land scorpions completely depend on vibrations. So what they do is they put their feet down and exquisitely sensitive to vibrations. And in fact, this is going to sound really crazy. Little tiny scorpions can vibrate the ground in a way that calls their mother over. Now, I have no idea what the mother does, but that was the observation. So I think
Dogs, we want to know about dogs.
all right, keep going then. Next slide. Well, if Nancy wants to know about dogs, we'll talk. So who knows what that is? Yeah, well, it's kind of a giveaway when you already said dogs. Yes, it's a dog's nose. And there's a couple of things about the nose that I wanted to point out. So we all know that dogs depend on olfaction. It's almost like it was a plant, Nancy, thank you. There's a lot of things about dogs that we know about. One is that they depend on olfaction far more than we do. How have they adapted themselves to occupy that niche? First of all, if you've ever looked at your dog's nose, or a dog's nose, these patterns are unique to any given individual, so it's basically a fingerprint for the dog. I don't know how you can use that, but it's kind of a piece of trivia. But much more important is the structure of the nose. And what you can see is there's a major nostril here, just like we have. But what you can also see is there's a slit on the side. And if you look at your dog's nose, you'll undoubtedly find that. And what does that do? It means that the dog can breathe in and out through its nostril, just like we do. And our sense of smell is very interrupted. You smell something when you breathe in, and you exhale, and you actually blow the odor away. It's very inefficient. So what the dog has done is create two chambers. One comes in and out and breathes. The other collects the air that's coming in with the odorants and holds on to it. So that even when it exhales, those odorants stay there, can continue to stimulate the olfactory nerves. Again, exploiting a particular exploitation of their environment, which requires olfaction. The next one. I just wanted to point out that was this. And one more. And what I wanted to point out is they use olfaction as an exquisite means of communication. And you've already seen this. This, I believe, is a dog that's very shy, because usually they will lift their tails up and facilitate the communication. And I think I'll stop there because it's time. I hope I got across the major points I was making. The major point is that our sense of reality is a function of our sensory systems. Our sensory system is a function of the environment that we choose to exploit. And our realities are utterly different because we see and sense and hear. All our senses are extraordinarily different. There's no way to create a reality other than through those senses that I know of. So let's open it up then to questions, discussions. Yeah, Phil.
I guess the question I'd like to ask, I know it's one we really can't answer, but where does cognition fit into this?
Well, hopefully that's something that Lou will get into a little bit. In fact, we don't know what cognition even is. We don't know.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Oh yeah, Phil asked where does cognition fit into the equation? And as he pointed out, I can't answer it. You're right.
But it touches at reality.
Absolutely.
Because if the creature is just a chemical system, basically through its neurons or however it transmits chemical ion sensors, then there may be no cognition at all. Oh, it may be just reacting as a chemical system.
Yeah, I mean, people for years thought of animals as automatons and humans as the thinkers and so on. I think a lot of people are changing that view, though, that animals are simple automatons. They make decisions.
Maybe that is related, that when you say, for example, how does the pill bud know how to curl up? Is it knowing? Is that what we understand?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't. But go on to the crayfish pictures if you could.
Yeah,
Just a few more.
that's it, Rudolph. How does the film bug know?
Right, and is what when we say no, is that what we mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Or is it an autonomous
Could you
machine?
go into the crayfish pictures? Or is that hard to go back?
It's all right.
Okay. That is a crayfish in a defense posture. If you go to pick up a crayfish, I work with crayfish, so you would go to the tank to pick it up, and there would be an entire tank of crayfish like this, and if I moved to the side, they would follow wherever I went. And it's kind of a scary look. But I didn't have a picture of a crayfish escape, but the next slide describes it. So have you ever seen a lobster in a lobster tank like a supermarket scooting backwards? That's the escape reflex. This crayfish has to make a decision. I'm coming close to the tank. Is it going to go like this and get me, or at least scare me? Or is it just going to skedaddle out of there as fast as it can, which is pretty fast? What is that? Is that cognition? I don't know the answer. I mean, none of us knows the answer.
Where does instinct, maybe in the genes or whatever?
Yes, there is instinct.
Instinct.
I think we live under the delusion that we don't operate under instinct.
That's a good point. What is
But yes, it is instinct, but there's a decision. So it's not an automaton.
But when the light that comes on, when the sun goes down, the light outside, at some point it has to make a decision to come on because the outside light, the sun light is too low. Is that a decision?
It is a decision, and that decision is influenced by the state of molt. So when it has this hormone called ecdysone, which is a molting hormone, it makes a totally different decision.
It's not just the sunlight that's...
No, there are decisions and they're influenced. Yes, and if you take, I was going to talk about bullhead fish. If they have a very dominance hierarchy. If you take one of those bullhead fish, set up a fight where it loses, it suddenly excretes a slime which has a different substance than when it was dominant. And all the other catfish know, hey, this is nothing to be afraid of here. It's the same catfish that the previous day had been the ruler of the roost. Yeah.
Steve, back to the 200 eyes.
Yes.
If the scallop has 200 eyes, do they have 200 optic nerves? And
Yes.
where do those nerves go to? Do they go?
They go to the retina.
They go where?
To the retina, and there's two different retinas.
And then how does that connect? There must be something.
They have what's called a diffuse nervous system.
Where, when you open a scallop shell, you pointed out the part that we eat, that muscle.
Yeah, there's
Where is
also-
that optic nerve located?
Each of the eyes. And then there's a ring brain. There's actually two rings of brain, is pushing the term a little bit, but it's a collection, they're ganglia, they're a collection of nerve cells. Very hard to see. It's the same in a lobster. Every time you open a lobster, there's a nerve cord. There's a ring of nerves up in the head. You just don't notice them because they look gelatinous, kind of. But I recorded from those neurons in that nerve cord. It's a real brain. There's no.
They are.
They make action potentials. They do all the things that a brain does.
Okay, I wanted to share something that I heard that I think relates strongly to this. Oh, I wanted to share something that I learned that I think relates a lot to this, and also just an idea that I wanted to put out there. I had occasion to interview a neurologist who had discovered some techniques for restoring sight in human beings under certain circumstances. And I asked him, had he done that? He said he had, But if it was done after a person was 3 years old, it would result in a very negative outcome because the individual would not be able to interpret
Right.
the input that they were getting.
Right.
And so it would be a chaotic experience, and that people would actually commit suicide as a result of being so overwhelmed by the constant input of incomprehensible visual input, which I thought was really interesting relative to this, and the whole notion that yes, we can observe, optic input, but in order to make sense of it and use it, we have to experience from the time we're born.
Yeah, I know what you're describing. I can give you others that you've probably lived with, which is that when you have pain and you take an opiate drug, you still have pain. You can even report, I'm at number 6, I'm at number 7, but it has no subjective quality to it. And so it's not that the opiate has gotten rid of the pain. These receptors are still generating those signals. But in the higher processing centers that give you the experience of pain, you don't have it anymore.
So the input is meaningless.
The input doesn't do it doesn't do the same thing.
Not all of it.
And then the other thing I was going to just note is that unlike other species, we have the ability to change or enhance our sensory input. And I at one point was writing about the subject of, so the invention of the microscope. Suddenly we are aware of a new reality, which
Right.
is, microscopic creatures, beings
Right.
that we never understood to exist.
Yeah, Roosevelt, he
Therefore-
called them animal cues, right? And he was totally amazed by it.
And so our understanding of what reality is changes because we change our ability to
Right.
perceive or the invention or the discovery of non-visual parts of the light spectrum. And suddenly realizing there's this whole universe of spectral input that exists out there that we had never seen before, and now suddenly our understanding of reality has changed because we're able to change our perception, because of our ability to build the technology that allows that to happen,
Right.
which makes us pretty amazing in that sense.
I just finished a book called Orbital, and it's a book about life on the space station. And it's an interesting book because perceptions of these astronauts changed incredibly as a function of that experience, looking at Earth from a distance rather than living on it. I think relates a little bit to what you're saying. There's another thing, there's a set of awful experiments that won Hubel and Wiesel the Nobel Prize, but they're very awful. They took kittens and sewed their eyes closed. And there were critical periods that were necessary for visual input in order for the brain to make the right connections. So they never made those connections. And they could never see certain things when they unsutured them. And you needed that experience for the brain needed that experience.
I want to take you back to the snake who can sense the mouse. Is the snake seeing in the infrared, or is it?
Yeah, so that's the whole beauty of, for example, when I mentioned touch. What is that like? We can't describe it for us. What is it like to have all these touch things, but you're not aware of them until somebody pokes you?
And are there some creatures who see in the ultraviolet?
Oh yeah, insects, many insects see ultraviolet.
So I know in the case of flowers, some orchids look white to us,
Right.
but under ultraviolet light, they are a completely different color, and the insect can see in ultraviolet, and therefore is attracted to certain segments of the flower, which...
Yeah, there's been some experiments in moths that when we see a tan moth, another moth sees this incredible number of colors, vivid colors that we don't see. There's evidence that dinosaurs weren't this dull gray to another dinosaur. They actually were very colorful creatures.
Yeah, and some pigmentation actually has been found even in the fossil record.
Yeah.
So yes.
So it's exactly what you're saying. We're limited by our sensory system. I mean, is it true that animals, for example, some animals can sense that an earthquake is coming?
So we're told.
No, I think they can, and I think it's because their tactile sense is so much stronger than ours. They're seeing the small tremors.
So they're feeling things that a seismometer would.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Could I just say something about Ed Yong's book? I'm not a scientist. I'm really not. And I read the book, but I didn't really read it. I read the part I was interested in, and then I'd get to all of this science stuff and switch to the next creature. And there are a lot of creatures all through the book, so that you learn what the different creatures are able to see and smell, senses that I could relate to, and easy things. You learn that elephants can only see blue and yellow. I don't know. And you wonder, what else is going on? It's a fascinating book, an immense world. It's really, really good.
It's amazing, yeah.
Yeah.
It changes your perspective.
It does, entirely.
Yeah.
Do you read scallops?
Do I tell? Yes. I also ate frasers.
No wonder they were scared. No wonder they were scared. They've been boiled.
I actually don't eat much red meat anymore. I do believe that there's a limit to how much a scallop can have awareness. Because they just don't have enough neurons, I don't think. Yeah. Hi, John.
So all the sensory inputs that you've been talking about generate images in the brain. But you can, the brain can generate...
For us, I don't think a scallop does.
Sorry?
I don't think it does for a scallop.
Well,
That's the
no.
mystery. Why so many eyes? They can't possibly do that. They don't even have brains.
In our case, in the case
In our case, yes.
the sensory input generates images in the brain. But the brain can generate its own images without any sensory inputs.
Right.
And in the case of people that we call insane, they have images that the rest of us don't believe in or dismiss. And so we make judgments about what other people say is reality on what basis? How do we know that what they're saying, what they're seeing, is not real? We feel that we know that they're insane. Those images, their images are not valid. Ours are valid. But is a dream any less real than an image generated through your sensory input through your eyes?
I had a section in the talk, John, that I took out. I just couldn't keep going on, which is religious experiences. So that there's a whole category of experiences that seems to happen in all religions the same. And that's this feeling of oneness, for example, and
But I get to talk about that.
you're going to hear? Are you going to talk about it?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's a different reality. It's an alternate reality. And drugs do the same thing, right? You know, psychedelics. I have very few answers.
Thank you so much. It's really,
Two weeks, come back.
yeah, come back. You mentioned before that it was every other.
I said second and fourth.
No,
Did I say every other?
Yeah.
Oh, second and
Second
fourth.
We'll be here.
You know, perception was one of my favorite classes at Binghamton, as far as my psychology.